Okay, so today in class we talked about how did World War II begin. Today we're going to talk about what actually happened during the fighting of World War II. So how did World War II progress? So the first question is, how did Germany essentially conquer Europe? So we said, and we left off in class today, that September 1st, 1939, Poland is attacked. And so here you can see Poland is attacked, and we have this technique that the Germans use, which is called Blitzkrieg, which is this lightning war. Throw everything you have, a fast armored column of troops supported by air power. So you're throwing everything you have at the other side. Poland had no tanks. They only had a few planes. Some of their troops were still on horseback. So Germany was able to very quickly defeat Poland. And as we know from the Nazi-Soviet pact, we talked about today in class as well, that this whole area here was to go to the Nazis. The Soviets were supposed to split the other half. This is why the Soviets don't declare war on Germany. And the Soviets were amazed by the speed of the Nazi advance. And the Soviets kind of very quickly bumbled to grab their half of the land because they were afraid that Germany would just take all of Poland. So on September 17th, 1939, Russia invades the other half of Poland and occupies the countries of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and creates puppet republics. You can see on the map here, this is Lithuania, and then Latvia, Estonia and Latvia are above it. Russia also at this point tried to invade Finland, but Finland was able to resist and they were able to maintain their independence. And really, the Red Army or the Soviet Army did not do a very good job in this invasion. They looked like they were kind of bumbling as they tried to, quickly grab land as fast as they could. So the poor performance of the Red Army, some feel, might have given the idea to the Germans that they should and could invade Russia because the army was not as good as they thought it was. But here we can see this is German troops marching down the streets of Moscow. Here we can also see the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis, which is kind of sealed with the Tripartite Pact in 1940. So then after that, after September, we have this quick action in September, and then there's kind of like a lull. And it's really until the spring of 1940 do we start to see anything really happen. So there's this kind of lull. The fronts were kind of quiet. Britain is rearming, and they're starting to blockade Germany. But in April, the Germans invade Denmark and Norway. And this was important because Denmark and Norway are actually rather close to Britain, and this is a place where then they're going to be able to have air and naval bases that's going to allow them to attack Britain. They then launch an air attack on Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and all of those countries give up in less than 2 weeks. The French and British armies were then in Belgium, were forced to flee the English Channel. And up until 1936, the French had expected that the Belgians were going to fortify the German border. Remember, because I showed you that map in class, and I said, the Nazis did exactly what the Germans did in World War I. They went through Belgium. And so the French had expected the Belgians to fortify that area. After a remilitarization of the Rhine, Belgium lost faith in France, and Belgium decided again to declare their neutrality because they didn't trust that France was really going to do much of anything since they let the Germans remilitarize the Rhine. And basically those borders were left unprotected, which then gave Hitler the in he needed to go around the Maginot Line in France and be able to attack France. So he invades France, and the French army was led by a group of older generals who were kind of more used to fighting in the way that World War I was fought. But we know just from World War I that the pace of technology was moving so very quickly that the way you fought in World War I was completely outdated compared to how you're going to fight in World War II now that airplanes and tanks are a much bigger issue. So basically, France collapses. And so France collapses and surrenders in June of 1940. So here we can see Hitler in Paris. So what it took all of World War I to accomplish, it and they never were able to accomplish it, which was to make France surrender. They were able to do it in a matter of months. And so here you can see Nazi troops marching down the streets of Paris. So basically Mussolini, also kind of seeing an opportunity, invades southern France on June 10th, 1940. And I'll talk about that in a second. But this is the Dunkirk evacuation. This occurs on June 4th, 1940. The issue is that we have the whole French army, or what's left of the French army, and the British army, which had been fighting, now kind of stranded. And if they all get captured by the Nazis, then how is Britain ever going to be able to launch any type of counterattack against the German army? So it's basically like an all call, where anyone that has a boat in Britain, Navy, commercial, fishing, leisure boat, anyone that has a ship or any type of boat, rowboat, whatever, cross the English Channel and pick up as many troops as you possibly can before the Germans manage to basically, hold the whole British army prisoner. France, once it's invaded, winds up being divided up into two parts. So the French government basically, like I said, was divided up. So you have in the north, you have occupied France. So this is like a German puppet state. In the south, you have what's referred to as Vichy France. Well, actually, I should say Germans on the occupied territories in France. Occupied France was not really a puppet state. Occupied France was basically the German army, the German government running France in the northern part. Vichy France was a puppet state. It was led by this man here, Henri Pétain, who was a World War I battle hero. He basically asked for an armistice. He's basically running a puppet state, which is like basically doing whatever the Germans want, and it's essentially a fascist state in southern France. The French do try to raise a resistance. There's the Free French movement, led by a man named Charles de Gaulle, and General Charles de Gaulle is going to become a very important figure, especially post-World War II France, because he's going to be the ruler of president of France post-World War II. He's in Morocco and trying to kind of drum up support for a French resistance movement. But so at this point, you can see the European theater of operations. The Germans are moving in. You could see the German advances versus the Allied advances. But this is showing the theater of operations and the furthest extent of Axis control by 1942. So it's everything here that's in red. I'll kind of outline it. This is all the land or the furthest extent of German control. So essentially, the Germans are going to wind up controlling pretty much almost all of Europe, minus the Soviet Union. This is not going to be easy then for the British to try to counter this and beat back against the Germans. Because remember, at this stage of the war, the U.S. isn't in the war, and the Soviet Union's not in the war. The Soviet Union's allied, kind of, sort of, because the Nazi-Soviet pact allied with the Germans. So it's basically Britain kind of left on their own, trying to figure out how to make this whole work. Which leads us to this question. How did the Battle of Britain impact the war? So the fall of France left Britain completely isolated. Hitler was willing to let Britain maintain its empire if Hitler was okay with letting Hitler basically control the whole continent of Europe, which the British government is really not going to be too happy with. So basically, Churchill comes to power. Churchill was an early critic of Hitler and the Nazis. He very much had a sense of the importance of history and the belief in the greatness of the British Empire, a love of freedom, and he refused to accept any sort of compromise with Britain. He was also a really talented writer and speaker, and he was really able to stir up the people and was a symbol for the people during World War II. He was one of his greatest achievements, though, some people say, was to create a relationship with FDR. And so our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, found ways to help the British, despite the fact that the American government was passing all these neutrality acts and we wanted to stay out of the war. So we were sending military supplies, warships, and just regular supplies in general in what was something that was known as the Lendlease Act. We were also aiding other countries like the Soviet Union and France and China, but a big portion of the money was going to Britain. So basically with the Lendlease Act, the idea was we would lend them military equipment in return for leases on military bases. So basically, Britain remained defiant and Hitler contemplated invasion. But it's really hard to invade Britain. We've talked about this already. It's an island. They have a really strong navy. It's really not an easy thing to think about an actual land invasion of Britain. So basically, the German Air Force began striking Britain, particularly their major cities like London, starting in August of 1940. And it started out with these attacks being on airfields and fighter planes. And had the tactic continued, Germany would have gained control of the air. They would have been able to have a successful invasion because they would have knocked out what was called the RAF, or the Royal Air Force. What happened is that the British began attacking German cities. And so in September, the Germans decided that they needed revenge against that, so they switched their attacks to attacking London. So for 2 months straight, London was bombed every night. Most of the city was completely destroyed, and about 15,000 people were killed. The idea was, on the German side, was that this was going to completely destroy the morale of the British people. Unfortunately for the Nazis, good for the British, is that it united the British and made them much more resolute. So pretty much the whole city gets knocked down. People are having to spend their nights in the tube and sleep in railway stations. These would function as bomb shelters. You can see this is the RAF, or the Royal Air Force. Ultimately, the Royal Air Force was able to inflict much more heavier losses on the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe, I'll spell that for you. The Luftwaffe is the German Air Force. So that was the German Air Force. They were able to inflict more heavier losses on them. Radar was coming into play. The British had good communication systems, and the British destroyed twice as many planes as they lost. And so Hitler eventually lost this battle and had to give up the idea of invading Britain. Now you can see Winston Churchill. You can see Churchill. Like I said before, one of the most important things was this friendship that Churchill and FDR had. So Roosevelt and Churchill signed a treaty of friendship in 1941 called the Atlantic Charter, fashioned after Wilson's 14 points, and solidifies this alliance between Wilson and Roosevelt. So the next question is, why was the German invasion of Russia a mistake? So this invasion that the Germans are going to take on Russia is one of the largest invasions ever. It was known as Operation Barbarossa, or Redbeard. It was 3 million German soldiers, 3,400 tanks. And basically, Hitler, even though he makes this pact with the Soviets, this Nazi-Soviet pact, always dreamed of defeating Russia and conquering Ukraine for this idea of living space. Those had always been goals for Hitler. The reason why he gets involved with the Nazi-Soviet pact is because he didn't want to get involved in a two-front war. So he wanted to knock out the West first and then focus his attention on the East. So basically for Operation Barbarossa, the idea was to destroy Russia before the winter came, because we know always that the winter is Russia's greatest ally or asset in a war. And the success in this really depended on an early start. The invasion was supposed to happen in April. It gets thwarted by Italy. Mussolini felt that he was being ignored by Hitler. He was told he couldn't annex any French territory in France or North Africa. And so Mussolini was upset, so he decides to launch his attack against the British in Egypt. He was able to drive the British back 60 miles, so then he decides to invade Greece. He does this without telling Hitler. He basically wanted Hitler to find out in the newspapers that the invasion was over. The British in North Africa counterattack. They then send help to the Greeks. Hitler is forced to divert his troops that were poised to invade the Soviet Union Operation Barbarossa to Greece to help bail Greece out. The Germans were able to push the British back. but it pushed back their schedule of invasion by 6 weeks, and now we're into June. So Operation Barbarossa was launched on June 22nd, 1941. The Russians were completely taken by surprise, and Stalin panicked because he thought that the Germans were their allies. So in the beginning, because of that surprise aspect, it almost worked. However, Stalin wasn't that crazy. He was paranoid and was not that crazy to think that the Germans were just going to help them. So he had, prior to World War II started, had moved and had dismantled many of the factories in Western Russia and had them moved deeper into Eastern Russia, away from the lines of attack from the Germans. So they were still able to resupply. But like I said, the frontier was not fortified. And on the first day, 2,000 Russian planes were destroyed. By November, Hitler was further into Russia than Napoleon ever gets. Russia winds up losing 2.5 million troops and lost over 14,000 tanks. Now, what changes everything is by August, the advance was delayed because they had to figure out a strategy. Instead of going straight to Moscow, the decision was to divert some troops southward, because this region here had tons of oil. And the decision was to divert some of their troops southward towards Stalingrad in order to gain control of the very rich oil fields. By the time they were ready for their offensive on Moscow, the winter happened to come particularly early that year and was a particularly really hard winter. This devastated the German army, who was not equipped for the Russian winter at all, because Hitler had such faith that this was going to be a quick, fast invasion, that they didn't equip the troops with winter uniforms. And so Stalin was given enough time to restore order, build defenses. Troops were able to arrive from Siberia, and by November and December, the Russians were in a position where they could counterattack. Remember also, the Russians do the scorched earth policy, where they will burn their own areas just so the other side can't use it for shelter or supplies. So here you can see this is the Battle of Stalingrad, which was the winter of 1942 to 1943. Eventually, they were able to counterattack and begin to push them back. So the next question, very quickly, what was Russia's plans for Europe? What did Russia hope to accomplish after all was said and done? Now, Hitler wanted what he referred to as the Third Reich to last for 1,000 years. But he didn't have a single plan of government. Some conquered territory would be annexed, like northern France. Some would be administered by German officials. Others would be run by puppet governments like Vichy France. You can think about it that way. Now, we know that the Nazi regime was unmatched for its planned terror and its inhumanity against the people. Their idea was that the Germans should have this living space, this Lebensraum, and this should be accomplished at the expense of people that were deemed inferior. European Russia, for instance, was going to be settled by Germans, and the local Russian people themselves were going to be forced into cheap labor or slave labor. The countries that were racially similar to the Germans, like the Scandinavians, the Dutch, the Swiss, they would be absorbed, re-educated, and purged of anyone who dissented. And they felt that they could adopt certain members of these lesser races into the master races. Like he thought the British or the French could be adopted into the master race. Hitler regarded his conquered lands essentially as sources of plunder. So Eastern Europe, he wanted to remove anything useful, including industry. Russia and Poland, they confiscated land. Western Europe, they were forced to support the occupying armies. So the last question, hopefully I can get to it because my thing is bugging out. Okay, so the last question is, how did Japan and America enter into the war? And this you pretty much know. The Japanese decided to invade Pearl Harbor. The reason why they invaded Pearl Harbor was because basically we decided to break off or cut off Japan's assets. We froze all their assets that were in U.S. banks, and we cut off their oil supplies. The British and the Dutch were also doing the same. This was prompted by the Japanese invasion of Indochina, Indochina being what today is Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, in July of 41. The Japanese in power saw this as a declaration of war, us seizing their assets and their oil resource, or their shipments of oil in placing an oil embargo. So as a result, on December 7th, 1941, Japan launches an air attack on Pearl Harbor, which was our chief naval base in the Pacific. And the next day, we and the British declared war on Japan, and 3 days later, Italy and Germany declared war on the U.S. So you can see Pearl Harbor from the cockpit of a Japanese pilot. Roosevelt signing the declaration of war. The U.S. Arizona going down. So think about this as your summary question. Why was Hitler able to get so far in his plans of conquering all of Europe?